Welcome everybody to the Rivian showroom in Atlanta, and this is the ADC's second forum discussion this year. We'll have two more before the end of the year. And the Architecture and Design Center is a nonprofit organization, in case you guys aren't familiar with us, dedicated to the advancement of quality architecture, design, and urbanism in Metro Atlanta and the state of Georgia. We are a frequent presenter of speakers and forums on different design topics, and we're dedicated to creating a critical understanding of Atlanta's massive growth and development. Another sponsor is, let me go to the sponsors here. AIA Atlanta, everyone knows they're the Atlanta chapter of the American Institute of Architects. They've graciously provided funding for us for this year's forum series. Again, the second of four. Be on the lookout for future presentations on our website, adcatl.org, /events for the next event. And then last but not least, Rivian, progressive future-oriented company, has provided the perfect location for us today. The manager of the Atlanta showroom would like to say a few words, DeAndre McNary, and make a very special offer. I think we're all going to get cars, so there you go. Thank you.
It might not go all the way over.
All right. My name is DeAndre. I am one of the sales advisors here at Rivian, actually. Thank you guys for coming in. We wanted to offer you guys to come and do some drives with us while you guys were here. So we have truck, and we also have the SUV that you guys can come and drive either now or after the event. But yeah, thank you guys for coming in. Yeah, sure.
They have to sign up with their email, right?
Yeah, you guys have to sign up with your email. We're doing drives up until 7:30. So if you guys wanted to come over.
And they can do it later?
Yes, you can do it later. Yep, or in groups. Cool.
So if you don't want to drive alone, you can get an assistant driver.
Thank you. Thanks. So just a note for everybody, speakers and audience, we are obviously recording tonight's presentation. It will be available on the ADC's website, and we also have a YouTube channel, and it will be available there. So look for it after this presentation. I'd also like to thank Clementine Cordner, who is the coordinator of tonight's events, and we could not have done it without her. We really could not have. So tonight's speakers are all experts in their respective fields, have considerable background and experience in creating the built environment in Atlanta and in other places. Tristan Al-Haddad is a working designer and visual artist. He previously held the position of assistant professor in the School of Architecture at Georgia Tech, holds a Master of Architecture from Georgia Tech, and has also studied at the University of Paris La Ville and Clemson's Daniel Center for Building Technology and Urban Design in Genoa, Italy. He's been exhibited in venues including the Pompidou Center in Paris, the High Museum of Art, of course, in Atlanta, the Boston Center for Arts, the International Contemporary Furniture Fair, and the American Institute of Architects Center for Architecture in New York. El-Haddad's work has been published in the New York Times, in Dwell, Metropolis, Art Papers, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He was one of 7 recipients of an Artadia Artist Award in 2009 and a Fulbright Scholar at the Universidad Technica Santa Maria in Valparaiso, Chile. In 2014, Al-Haddad was selected by the U.S. Department of State to represent the United States at the Colombo Art Biennial in Sri Lanka. You can see more of Tristan's work, and there's some pretty incredible stuff at his website at formations-studio.com. Sitting next to him in the middle is Michael Carroll. He's a tenured associate professor at Kennesaw State University. Prior to this appointment, he was an assistant professor at Syracuse. He's a registered Canadian architect, and Michael is a founding partner of Atelier Build, a design build firm based in Montreal. Atelier Build was awarded the Canadian Professional Prix de Rome of Architecture in 2004. Michael is the founder and director of the MAT Lab at Kennesaw State, a materials library, lab, and exhibition space. His research focuses on materiality in contemporary architecture with a focus on material expressions of underrepresented communities. As a principal investigator, he is the architectural designer of the KSU Mini Pavilion at the Cobb County Safety Pavilion, together with Billy Kaihe, is that right? They led the charge to construct the pavilion and use it as a site for off-campus research, as well as a classroom to instruct elementary school students in the interconnection between safety and sustainability. And last but not least is my very good friend and colleague at Praxis 3, Stuart Romm. Stuart is a professor of practice at the Georgia Institute of Technology, having taught both graduate and undergraduate architectural design studios, plus a range of praxis courses in the College of Design for the past 25 years. He's a founding principal in the Atlanta architectural firms of Praxis 3, where I work, and Romm and Pearsall. Both are multidisciplinary practices focused on civic and educational buildings, advanced automotive facilities, and urban social housing. In these roles, he has developed a special expertise in confronting the emerging intersections between media technologies and public space. He has also held a special interest in the challenges of affordable housing, beginning with Romm and Pearsall's award-winning entry to the Progressive Architecture Affordable Housing Initiative and Praxis 3's Renaissance Walk project on historic Auburn Avenue that won a South Atlantic Region AIA Honor Award in 2009. He was a lead designer for several other award-winning projects, including Fire Station Number 2 in Decatur and the College of Environment and Design, which won 2011 and 2013 AIA Georgia Design Awards. He's been invited to present many of these projects and conferences, including the CIB Tokyo Conference on Urban Regeneration and the 21st Century Congress of International Comparative Literature Association held in Vienna in 2016, and the AIA National Convention on Everyday Urbanism, amongst many others. Tonight, the way this is going to work, each speaker will give a brief presentation on their work and the subject of the discussion tonight. After their presentations, we'll start the forum with several moderator-led topics, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. So I believe Tristan's going to lead us off. Yeah, for those of you who did not look before you registered, the official topic is Designing for the Future, Media Modularity and Materials, the Future of Design in the Built Environment. So, and everything this year has a sustainability kind of theme, so this is very much about that as well. Tristan, do you want to start? And I'm controlling the slide, so if you could just kind of tell me when to change.
Sure. So, you know, when I was invited to join this talk, the question was, well, what do you talk about for 5 to 7 minutes on the future? Like, it's kind of a hard topic. So what I did instead, and I do a lot of different things. So I'm an architect, artist, kind of inventor, have a startup in the solar space, do a lot of different things. So what do you talk about in 5 to 7 minutes on the future? So I decided to go with a site sort of selective series of concepts. So I'm going to show 2 projects. Both are at Ponce City Market, or one is built here at Ponce City Market. And we've got another project actually with Brian in the solar space, but because we're talking about wood, we won't show that one today. So I want to show 2 projects, Forest and then the Taurus Arch. So this piece here, this is all funded by the Georgia Forestry Foundation, looking at how to promote mass timber, cross-laminated timber as a sustainable and just really extraordinary material for so many reasons, and we'll talk about what the reasons are in a few minutes. But this piece is, if you go into the kind of, what do we call it, the exterior-interior corridor in here, you'll see this Taurus Arch swing, and the intent was to create this kind of playful installation with a toroidal swing that people could gather on and play on and enjoy, but then also get an experience and that sort of sense for the material. This is all 5-ply CLT, grown in Georgia, laminated in Alabama, and fabricated on Fulton Industrial at my studio. So Jamestown, who owns this building, also owns a lot of timberland. So they have an interest in timber. And so Jamestown, along with the Georgia Forestry Foundation, they're really heavy into cross-laminated timber as one of the main kind of future drivers of sustainability and construction. Obviously, they have some financial motive as well. So what we said was, how do we promote this material, which is not a new material? It's an old material, right? But how do we think about the future of an old material? And how do we promote it at Ponce City Market? So we took this approach of kind of 3 scales, small, medium, large. We already have the large, 619, which is the building over here where Pottery Barn is. That's all CLTs. I think it's one of the first CLT buildings in the state. So that's really like a huge kind of thing. So that was the large. So we said, okay, before that building goes online and people get to experience that building, let's do a kind of small and medium scale installation to promote that. So the small scale was the Taurus Arch. The medium scale, which is going to end up not coming online before that building is done, is the Forest project. And we can go to the next slide. So what we wanted to do was create or design a kind of installation, sort of architectural installation that would activate the south lawn, which is this lawn here. You can just kind of click through these slides, David. Sure. Activate the south lawn here, create a kind of experience of living within the forest, and then the kind of experience of actually being in a forest, kind of verticality, framing of the sky, direct connection to the materials. This is a great view. Hold right here for a second. Sure. This even starts to speak to, you know, when you're like on the highway, going down the highway, and you see the managed forest and the planted forest, and that kind of rhythm that starts to be, especially when you're going 80 miles an hour down the highway, that rhythm that's produced. So we're kind of playing a game there as well. Next slide, please. So here you can see where the piece is going to be situated. This is all made out of 5-ply CLT. Next slide. There will be 2 or potentially 4 swings, and then we'll have other programming in the, you know, obviously it's a 3x3 design. We'll have other programming in the other cells, but also the south, the 1x3 kind of row at the bottom also creates a kind of proscenium that frames a performance space that will be activated, or that will be kind of in concert with the amphitheater across the way. Next slide. This is in my studio. This is my, you know, we call her Daenerys, mother of all dragons, because she can mill wood and she can breathe fire with the plasma. It's really pretty cool. It's an 8-axis robot that we use to fabricate a lot of our pieces. So here you can see we're kind of nesting this geometry in a typical CLT panel that can then be spliced in the middle, so that we have a kind of efficiency of production. Next slide. Okay, this should be an animation. So here we'll see the piece at night and the way in which you can activate the lawn at Ponce City Market. Each of the panels is going to have, we're going kind of back and forth with Michael Phillips, who's the president of Jamestown. You know, we either are going to have a text that starts to talk about each of the species of pine. This is all pine, juvenile pine in South Georgia. Either talking about the species of pine, or what we thought what could be kind of fun is to work with poets and have poets write little poems about the forest and about trees. So we're kind of playing around with those different ideas. But you can see the way in which it would be activated at night. Has anyone here worked with CLT on a project? Amazing material. I mean, like, it truly is amazing material. So much potential.
We've had a lot of clients interested in working with it,
Yeah.
but so far no.
What's the hesitation?
You know, I think they don't know enough about it, number one, and they're all waiting to be the second
They don't want to be the first.
developer to do it. But now there are a few projects, at least 2 or 3.
In the office?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean in Atlanta.
In Atlanta,
there are
right.
2 or 3 projects.
Yeah.
And there's a local source too.
And
which is
T1.
important. Yeah,
I guess
T1
that was
and
the
then
first
this
one, actually,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And that was a big part of what is motivating both Jamestown and the GFA is, you know, nobody wants to be first, right? Nobody wants to be the earliest adopter of something like this. How tall is that? This is 36, the cube is 36 by 36 by 36.
It's a beautiful piece.
Thank you. And you can keep going. This goes on. Yeah, so keep going, next slide. This just gives you sort of a sense of the daytime activation. The swing, by the way, is a lot of fun. You should go out there and check it out. It's a lot of fun. It was even more fun before. We had to put in some hard linkages at the base, but before we had a soft linkage at the base that kept it from crashing into the walls, and it was like riding a snowboard. I mean, it was so smooth. It was fantastic. But those grommets kept wearing out, so we had to put a hard linkage. All right, next slide, please. So I think we were asked to give a little blurb or kind of thesis on what we wanted to talk about, and what I want to talk about is the word automatic, whatever that means. And I think I'm just using that as a provocation, as a kind of foil for the conversation. But, you know, automatic, which can be defined as self-moving or self-motivated. Wood is very much automatic. If we start thinking about the future, I'm just going to talk a little bit, you know, sort of leading in. If we're going to talk about the future and AI and, you know, all this sort of stuff, then wood has to be part of that conversation, because wood is automatic. Wood is, you put a seed in the ground, and 80 years later, wood will soak up all this carbon, so you don't need all this technology to like do carbon capture and all of that. It just does it. It will provide habitat. It will provide beauty. It will provide experience. And then you can harvest it and use it and store that carbon for 500 years if done properly, right? So that's automatic in my mind. That's the future. Are we going to talk about, I guess we'll come to this at the questions, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. So Michael is next.
So I'm at Kennesaw State University, and this, I guess what I'm showing you is the product of a studio I did last spring with, or last fall actually, with a group of fifth-year architecture students. So in their next semester, they do their thesis. So this is called Focus Studio. And basically, it's myco-based materials for architectural application. So I liaised with a microbiologist, Dr. Chris Cornelissen at KSU, and he worked with myself and my students in the production of these artifacts. And so this idea of using a biological process in a design studio, how does that intersect? And I don't know if any of you know what mycelium is. If you know, the fruit of mycelium is a mushroom. So mycelium grows through the ground, it consolidates the ground. It's basically a digester and is essential for human life. And so let's go on with some of the slides. So this was actually part of a presentation that was a research paper that was done at UMass Amherst. I think we have a graduate here. So this was also in for a exhibition at the Atlanta Design Festival last October. I don't know how many of you saw that exhibition, but it was in the new Tom Kundig building. And so it was a kind of interesting studio. We didn't necessarily do a building per se. It was about a kind of process, and it was also about the production of this exhibition and also the investigation of mycelium. And so the whole idea is, and working with Chris on this, is basically he is one of the key researchers in using propagating mycelium for, optimizing mushroom production, culinary mushroom production in the state of Georgia. So they've actually invented this, I think it's called Mycologic is their company. They've invented these refrigerated trucks essentially, which are optimized for the fruiting of mushrooms. And it also intersects with the idea that in Georgia, we have an abundance of agricultural waste. So what do we do with this agricultural waste? So one idea is that we use mycelium, mix it with the agricultural waste, and you could produce panels, you could produce all kinds of things that have architectural application. So there's several kind of themes, I guess, this idea of a circular economy, that there is no idea of waste, everything can be used, but also using, instead of manufacturing materials, using a biological process to actually produce panels, to produce even structures that are made of, use mycelium. And this is not certainly my own research. There's lots of universities around the world, certainly within the US, who are looking at mycelium in terms of some kind of architectural need. And in the future, probably what will happen is mycelium will be engineered so that it will be stronger, it will be more resilient. When you mix the mycelium with agricultural waste, it actually changes its properties of the material. It becomes thermally more resistant, so it's better for insulation. It becomes more hydrophobic, and it becomes more fire retardant. So these are things that are pluses in terms of architectural application. And this whole idea of looking for biopolymers. So the number one biopolymer is cellulose. The second one is chitin, and chitin is related to mycelium. So we're getting a bit of a biology lesson here. So these are my students. There was 15, very diverse, a very talented group of students. And this was very much an experiment. I mean, we really didn't know how this was going to end, because the first thing they had to do, so I'm the founder and director of the MAT Lab. Chris is the founder and director of the Bioinnovation Lab at KSU. So these two labs came together. Students went to the lab. They had to learn these various protocols for the handling of the mycelium and mixing it with the substrates. And of course, you have to make sure that it's not contaminated. If it gets contaminated, then you kind of have to start over again. So we did these 15 experiments. Some of the students worked together, and there were different kind of directions in terms of the actual outcomes. So these are the different strains, the different substrates. So you have reishi mushrooms, you have lion's mane, you have like a whole set of different strains that were available. And then you have the substrates. So I've mentioned agricultural waste. So you have like different like corn husks, you have peanut shell hulls, you have all this cotton gin waste that's abundant, and so they were prepared in the lab to be mixed with the mushroom strains. And so basically you do the prep, you do the incubation, and then the growth part, that was the most difficult. So imagine you're doing a design process, and of course we're just used to things happening in a certain way, but when you're doing with a biological process, it may not go the way you think. So usually it would take 2 weeks for the mycelium to consolidate, the agricultural waste. That didn't happen. It actually took way longer, and there was also some of the panels were larger sizes, so we actually had to transport them to the refrigerated container, which was a larger area that we could put all of these products in. The other part of it was we had to produce artifacts for an exhibition that was in October, so we had to make sure that we accelerated the growth as much as possible. So there was lots of different components of this actual production. So this is Clay and Angie's project, and they did these 3D prints, and then they wallpapered it with a newsprint. They painted it with agar, and then they used rhizopus seeds. And so the rhizopus seeds basically propagated and created this kind of mottled effect on the actual kind of designed artifacts. So one was designed as a kind of column, another one as a vase, and they also did a tabletop. You can go to the next one. So this was part of the exhibition. So in a way, it was also just to see kind of aesthetically what this kind of mottled surface would look like. How do you deal with this as a kind of architectural look, as an aesthetic? And so this was how it was actually displayed in the exhibition. They actually used the pecan hulls with the king oyster mushroom strain. And so they went through different iterations. So with the newspaper, for example, they first used the one with ink, and that was a no-no because it was more contaminated, I guess. So then they just used the newspaper without any ink in it. So there was lots of different, there was a learning curve to all of this. Next slide. This was a lampshade by Megan. And so basically she got a lampshade, she lined it with cling wrap, and she basically plastered it on the inside with this kind of porridge mixture. I mean, that's essentially what it is. In this case, it was pecan hulls again with the oyster mushrooms. And basically it consolidated, I think it took up to 4 weeks because there were different thicknesses, so it took longer to propagate. And then it was released from the mold, and this was how it was displayed during the exhibit. Next one. This is, I'm trying to remember, Abigail's work. So this, we had a carbon fiber kind of grid that was part of a kind of, it's a kind of reinforcement that can be used. And in this case, she wove the newsprint through this grid and put the rhizopus seeds, well, the agar and then the rhizopus seeds. And then once again, it created this kind of mottled effect. But it was kind of Soji screen kind of inspired. Next slide. So this was for sound attenuation. So this is Harry's project. So she did these kind of undulating kind of tiles that were vacuum formed with PETG. And then basically it was filled with the mixture, in this case was sawdust and pecan hulls with reishi mushroom. And basically these were different tiles, and so you can imagine, I mean, this could be implemented because first of all, it's not in a wall, it's a panel, and this could be used certainly for sound attenuation, within a space. So this is the product. This was one experiment that actually I did. So this Branch Technology, which is in Chattanooga, I don't know if you're aware of this company, but they do this 3D matrix, double curvature walls. So years ago, for the MATLAB, they gave me one of their panels. So I called them up and I said, do you mind if I use it with this, with the mycelium and see what happens? And they said, excellent, because they're looking like for biopolymers. They use just kind of standard polystyrene that's blown through this 3D matrix now. So this is one experiment that I'm going to continue on. with them as a collaboration. Next slide. And this was probably the most ambitious project by Luke. So he did these 3D printed forms, these kind of scaffolds, and then he printed this kind of solid, more solid areas. He was coffee grounds with the reishi mushroom. The whole idea is that air could flow through this and could actually purify the air because it does help absorb toxins. And so it was kind of extrapolated into a kind of tower. And so this was, so I really like this image on the left, this kind of a scientist meets architect. So with the 3D printed scaffold, filling it with the coffee grounds with the reishi mushroom. And this was all done, you know, in under certain protocols, because of course, once again, you didn't want it to become contaminated. Next slide. He also did one that was more filled with the myco mix. So the myco mix becomes whiter as it consolidates. Next slide. And so the new Tom Kundig building was the site for the Atlanta Design Festival in October. So we had a space. Next slide. And then, so this is the exhibition. It was also a larger exhibition called Micro Macro, which was showcased the work from year 1 to 5 of KSU students. So as part of that, we showed the outcome of the Myco Lab as a 5th-year project. And so these are the different artifacts that were displayed. Next slide. And this is the opening. So you can see he actually created this plexiglass enclosure. So what was really interesting was that these artifacts were actually alive. They continued to grow and propagate during the exhibition. And because this was in a kind of micro environment, this webbing, you could see this kind of webbing happening in the openings. So it was really interesting to think of these as live things rather than just static models. It's something that was actually growing. And it was a really good experience for the students. They met, of course, all the attendees in terms of the opening, and there's a whole cohort from France, and they had already had a mycelium exhibition, and so there was a whole discussion about the content of this one. Next slide. And we also created a lab table to show the actual process and the stages of the mycelium growth and the different strains. So it was a kind of, to give it a kind of lab. The whole idea was that this part was a kind of lab for the production of these different artifacts. Next slide. So this is a kind of the provocation, I guess. And this comes from I'm a big fan of Kingo Kuma, the Japanese architect. And he has this whole idea that there's a paradigm shift in architecture that is happening, or hopefully is about to happen, where there's a shift from monumental to environmental. So buildings, instead of standing apart from nature or being objectified or looked at as monumental, are now engaged as part of the environment. So the idea that, let's say in terms of mycelium, that we could actually, once again, as I mentioned, use an organic process in the production of, architectural components, but actually buildings, theoretically being grown, or creating scaffolds that would direct organic growth. So these are things that would produce, I think, more engaging environments, more sustainable, resilient environments, but also the idea that architecture is not something that's static and something that stands apart, but something that we can engage in, but also something that we actually have to take care of. I think a lot of buildings, we don't take care of them. So the idea that a building would have to be tended to, that would have to be groomed, that maybe it could smell. One of the problems with the mycelium is actually it produces a smell, although now there are enzymes apparently you could use as an admixture to reduce the smell. But the idea that maybe it's okay that buildings could smell, that they're alive, and that they have they need to be tended. I was just in Barcelona with some of my students, and buildings that I saw 10 years ago, these beautiful buildings, have not been well tended, especially the ones that have a lot of technology involved. They look, you know, they're literally deflated. The Cloud9, the pillows are deflated. It's really sad to see. And so the idea that we have to take care of buildings. They need us to take care of them. So the idea that this would be a shift, you know, from they're not standalone, they need us, they need the engagement. So that's, I guess, the provocation.
Thank you, Michael. So bringing it home will be Stuart Romm.
So this is also related to my academic role. I've been part-time teaching at Georgia Tech, and this grew out of the studio that I just taught this past fall, and it really is one of those cases where David called us experts here. This is on a topic that I'm not expert in. In fact, most often when I'm teaching, I'm more learning than teaching it. This is about a competition that was titled international. It's called AI and biomimicry. Two topics that I didn't know a lot about. I was a little anxious about both. And the provocation toward the end is going to be about that. We know about artificial intelligence and some of its potentials and its anxieties. And biomimicry is a term about nature and what Michael and Tristan have been talking about, natural materials and environmental issues. But the term biomimicry has, you know, many insinuations, and it sometimes sounds like mimicry is more shallow, more superficial about nature. It is, in fact, meant to be a very deep dive into not just the look of nature, but how it's processes. And really, 60 years ago, I'm going to show you some history here. A great book by Leo Marx, The Machine and the Garden, was kind of that dialectic. In other terms, the machine for the, you know, industrial and the digital, and the garden for the biosphere. So Cedric Price, whose Fun Palace is shown here, was one of the first visionaries, proponents of cybernetics and the influx of the machinic into our built environment, so to speak, and designed things that not necessarily were built, but they were anticipating this, frankly, friction between that which is technological and that which is natural. And so this was a prior studio, but this became a bit of a running idea through our studio as we were taking on AI and biomimicry. So next, what you'll see also in a previous one was dealing with the machinic and the natural, and it's prefiguring. Again, some of this is going to sound pessimistic than optimistic. I'm going to try to put both out as provocations that, in fact, the intrusion of the machine, like the locomotive in that first painting, into our natural habitat would have, in fact, degrading consequences, say the Horizon oil spill just not that long ago. So again, the next slide, we were looking at some of these, but this competition was to be very excited and excited about the future. It takes as its premise nature as inspiration, again, from the cave dwellings of our ancestors to the bird-inspired designs of early flying machines. The natural world has always been architects' greatest muse, and today we see the influence of these marvels around us, from Gaudi's use of nature's functional forms with structural problems that addresses, to other again, natural systems, ventilation systems similar to sea sponges and corals. This was sponsored by the Gaudi Foundation, by the way, so that was a kind of inspirational, exemplary predecessor to this. If we go to the next one, though, on the other part of the dialectic was the digital world, the AI, and this, again, was heralded in very glowing terms. This transformative technology promises to reshape our world and architecture with its inherent creativity. It stands to be one of the most impacted fields, architecture. And the introduction of AI in architecture heralds a future where design may be not only more efficient and innovative, but also significantly more sustainable. That was the hypothesis to be tested by our students. And this shows sort of its realm now, many of you are familiar, what is known as AI, which is a very broad banner over things, but in this case, Midjourney, one of the software tools that is out there, being very much this tool for envisioning and creating ideas about form that the machine can at least do a lot faster, so our imaginations can cycle through possibilities so much faster. So those were the two premises, and this was a competition that had online remote sessions with experts, especially well, in both these fields. There was Grimshaw, Herzog and Demeron, Zaha Hadid's office. They all had people speaking to these issues. So if we go to the next one, but what was also happening at the same time, a colleague that I've known, Joseph Choma, who's now the director at Florida Atlantic University's architecture program, was also tracking, as it turns out to be, Cedric Price and the sort of beacon towards the introduction of technology as this great force for opportunity back in the 1960s. Again, back in the era of Cedric Price, if we go to the next one, he, in fact, a famous quote was, "Technology is the answer, but what was the question?" And this is from 1966. So there really is a history here. I'm going to do a very brief. These are his slides, and we'll go to the next one that was presented at his lecture. And this showed, in fact, what you're going to see an article at the end of this with almost the same question now, but this one way back in 65 said, "Will the computer change the practice of architecture?" And it was already being put out there as this great revolution and possibility, but potentially this great question and challenge to us. So the next one, this is architectural record from 65, but this is also the mainframe computers that are current phones have more power, computing power, than these huge mainframes that took whole buildings to chill out and be in. And so this is at the MIT labs, again, 1963, sketching the first computer-aided drafting and modeling. Go to the next one. And but in fact, there really was some science behind all of this that was going to influence a lot about what architecture could do and form. In this case, a parallel industry, so to speak, the Boeing aeronautics industry was mathematically, as it says, defining wave motion surface and aerodynamic configurations for the optimization of our aircraft and things like this. So this became, in fact, the same industry that Swan Katia under Frank Gehry's pioneering, that was modeling form for the aerodynamics, but then became modeling for architecture. So we go to the next one. And in fact, though, again, in some very serious but very wonderfully festive and fun formal investigations by the engineer and architect Frei Otto. Again, back in 1964, you see the physical manifestations of these possibilities where the science of aerodynamics and geometry informed a lot of architectural form. So this was a premise that we looked at for the insertion of the computer and AI into ours. If we go to the next one, though, we're also going to see, well, this, in fact, what today's technological advances is bringing us, mostly speed and calculations, to be able to envision the possibilities out of the imaginations, but with help of just all kinds of software programming, the ability for these kinds of images to be just conjured in replications and iterations at lightning speed. And this is Midjourney, and if you've been on there, this is the home page, but it's scrolling with hundreds and thousands of these possibilities. The next one, though, if we go to it, is in fact a call from our host of the competition to say, well, it's time to ask nature. This is the site, nature.org, that in fact looks, when I say the past, but meaning it just looks back millennia to say that really those forms that we're discovering how to do have in fact been discovered how to emerge through evolution in the natural realm for life to take root, so to speak, and inhabit our planet. And those examples, the biological strategies that you see here, not just the look, but what are the strategies for survival that different organisms and life forms have taken that can influence us in architecture. And this was a great compendium of those examples, predecessor forms, if you ever want to look at that, but there's many out there now. So if we go to the next one, so this is just one of many. This is by Mick Pierce, gave a lecture on his Eastgate Center, which was built in South Africa. Again, the building's passive cooling system is modeled after the ventilation systems of termite mounds. And what can we learn from them? This was so many examples from that the presentations in that site, that each student took on a example from nature to learn from. How could we apply those lessons that we think lower forms of life than humans, but have perfected really over a long time, that computers can speed up, but that have enabled adaptation to our environment during a time of, urgency, climate urgency. So if we go to the next one, you'll start to see some of the students' work now is showing here, and this does not look particularly biomimetic in that regard. This was, if you go deeper into the termite mounds and understand how the cellular systems work for heat cooling differentials and ventilation, and Ed Aiken, by the way, was there for this entire, thank you for being here today, and thank you for being part of our studio workshops and reviews, and was helping us do all this. And of course, his the practice and get an enterprise right now, Cove Tool, was a great tool that was offered the students use to test these propositions about the performance, nature's performance, not just its look. And sometimes it does take on the look. We're going to see that in just a minute. So this is one example. If you go to the next one, but this is now a quick survey into the ones that won the competition. Again, this was international. There were thousands of entries, and I'm going to show them kind of up. They are very stunning visualizations of lots of possibilities, and many of them students took on some deeper sort of substantive evaluations and performance kind of testings of these ideas. But you'll see, for the most part, I was struck by how pretty much all the winners had to, in fact, seemingly emulate more natural forms that we see in the environment that are more organic, biophilic, and grow, not necessarily we associate with architecture, but increasingly we may well be doing that. So we'll go to the next one. You'll just see some of these. I'm not going to get into all of the details of these, but you can see they were, though, cited all over in places that were very challenging climates that they dealt with, rainfall and water remediation, with solar harvesting, with passive ventilation, with shadings. And it does turn out that natural forms are often just more intrinsically able to do that in this case, they can collect water as plants do and things like that. So architecture can collect and distribute. So we'll go to the next one. And they really are some beautiful forms, as you can see. And Midjourney can render them so quickly with different seasons, different times of day. They glow, and they are just really mesmerizing forms, as you can see from these stunning pictures. Go to the next one. That was third prize. Second prize is this one, a bit more of a spiraling kind of tower that, again, I can't read all of what it's saying, but you can see what the premise of these very adventurous studies were. If we go to the next one, is the first prize. They're very, this one is using, again, very natural materials that are, again, adapted from wood and cellular forms and things. Again, Michael, much like what you've been working with materially. They studied, by the way, and I was going to the one predecessor we actually had at Georgia Tech was Achim Menges, that has studied so many of those photosensitive materials that react to sunlight and actually physically open and close, and I think this one was dealing with that too. So there are some amazing possibilities. I'm very excited about this competition, even though if you go to the next one, which is more these are some of the honorable mentions. You'll see that our students, and we didn't have as long as, I know I'm giving excuses, we only had 5 weeks of our studio overlapped the competition, where it was actually introduced a good many months before, and I can see some very refined and exquisite visual modelings and forms and renderings done through Midjourney. And when I say Midjourney, maybe they used other tools, but we were asked to use that, and we got great instruction. One associate of Zaha Hadid's office now gave the best tutorials on how to optimize all the prompts for Midjourney. Was just amazing. So last one maybe on this series, you'll see some more. They're really just amazing visions. That one called Gaudi's Oceanic Vista on the right. So if we go to the next, and I'm almost going to be done, well, that's another one. I mean, you're starting to see more of these, certainly in schools and in renderings. There's not as much of it built yet, but of course that's always at the cutting edge of the new forms and revolutions in form as things get envisioned, as Friotto did, and then the construction realities hopefully follow. But this is one of my students, two of my students actually did this great, I thought, project, and you remember this one. And this one did not take on literally as much the biophilic forms or biomimetic forms. They took AI to be more performance-oriented, and in fact, as you'll see, used Cove Tool and Climate Studio and others to really test out the propositions in these circular economies, how this could become a lab for different kinds of climates, could learn to reciprocate. Much how the biggest, if I had to say an idea I put in personally to the thing, was how do communities of organisms work, not just single ones. The collaboration and sort of supporting reciprocity of communities in the forest, trees and their roots and abilities to share and distribute things. They wanted to see how that kind of circular economy you see in the upper right could happen for a lab that would be at Georgia Tech to test these propositions, even though we only have one climate, seemingly a very hot one right now, in Atlanta, to have these simulated or different habitat biomes, as they call them. We'll go quickly through the rest because I do want to get to my provocation. Biospheric circularities was their proposition. Lots of study and depth and research into that. And that, yeah, Teresa Lee and Kobe Harris, I should mention, the two great students. They're seniors and just graduated. Go to the next. And just this is some of the heat mapping for performance from the Cove Tool and other tools they use to really dig deep into the science of their propositions. And next. But they got into, I still think, some beautiful architectural visualizations, just not quite as explicitly biomimetic, I think, in the eyes of the jury. So we got in comments back. Go to the next. And again, they were using AI as an ongoing tool about the processes of being able to take lessons, learn lessons from these different habitats, these biomes, and apply them to see what processes could be active in helping climate sharings between these biomes. And then this was, I'll end with this one. This, in fact, came out at the same time, an article that is about AI. It said, will architects really lose their jobs to AI? I also teach the practice course studios. That was their big job. Why are we sitting here learning about business practicing architecture in today's day and age? It's going to be radically transforming as we get automated out of our work and AI. They were very anxious, and there are many. What we should talk about tonight, many in this article are quoted as saying to be mindful and concerned about some of its negative possibilities as the automation of what we currently do as humans, but it mostly landed on saying, but let's not jump to the conclusion. Let's see what, in fact, its beneficial opportunities can be. If you go to the next one, which I will say will be the last one, it is ironic. That one does say Midjourney has been used to create visualizations of architecture projects, such as this image by Zaha Hadid. And the last quote says, our current methodology will radically change but not be substituted. And to this end, architects will need to stay at the center of being the driver within that process. So I'll leave with that provocation. We'll be talking about all these issues. It's really a fascinating time we live in at a crossroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank all of you. That was fascinating. So we're going to start with a few moderator questions for me. I'm going to start at a really broad-based kind of 10,000-foot discussion level and move into more specific topics that take advantage of these guys' expertise. The first one is a very general question. The future is a topic of endless fascination and in some cases, like maybe every 4 years or so, possibly dread. It's almost an impossible thing to know, but we continue asking anyway. We're obsessed with it to some degree. My first question is, possible black swan events like pandemics and wars aside, what 2 or 3 future trends do you see affecting the built environment the most? And AI can only be one of these. So, Tristan, you want to start?
So I'm just going to get one,
Good.
and it's going to sound weird. So if we're talking about trends, I think one of the trends that I see that I find interesting, maybe terrifying, is the way in which, let's put it this way, that if the world becomes, if the financial system becomes de-dollarized, what happens to capital markets and what happens to the built environment? And what do I mean by that? Does that make any sense to anyone? Yeah? Okay. So if we can no longer borrow obscene amounts of money, right, because the dollar is the world's central reserve currency, then we're going to have to start building things really differently. And that's really where I wanted to go with this. You know, we're not going to be able to build at $300 a foot anymore. We're going to have to build at $100 a foot. And that's going to be a real thing. That's not going to be an aspirational thing. It's going to be a mandatory thing. And so that could happen very rapidly. You know, we could give the, you know, water, oil, all that kind of stuff. I could see this happening very rapidly within the next, 10, 15 years. And so I think we should get ahead of it. I think we don't wait for it to be mandated. I think we take it as not something that we have to do now, but something that we'll have to do in the future, something that we want to do now. So the challenge, can we build for $100 a foot? 100. Why? Because you're going to have to.
Well,
I think future trends, you're going to have to.
Yes, and
You won't have access.
so in our own practice, we have jobs that are $300 a square foot, but we have jobs that are $100 a square foot. But as you know where I'm going, that doesn't mean we've built that. It means we've renovated existing buildings, and so that to me is so much more now becoming the priority, is to finally
100%.
adapt and recycle what we've already built. I think it's going to become increasingly, and this interesting in studios, at schools of architecture, most of you have been through them. We almost always give studio projects about new buildings on sites, and instead of really much about renovating existing buildings occasionally. And I think that's going to be increasingly the world that we're going to.
Totally agree. And that's going to require, maybe we might call them new. We always want to say everything's new. A lot of it's going to be old methods that we rediscover. Old methods, we'll call them new. They're actually old. The old and the new are oftentimes interchangeable, right? But I think you're 100% right, Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, I think, is this on? Yeah. We had Aaron Betsky give a lecture at KSU, and so his big thing is that we have all of this stuff that we've built, we've maximized out. So yeah, we need to recycle it. We need to reimagine it. We need to reprogram it. I mean, just look at this space. We all know what this looked like. I know 10 years ago, it was a kind of wasteland, and now it's become all the, this incredible kind of center, a catalyst for development in the city. But I would also argue that I think as architects or as designers, we have to create more value for architecture and more why people should invest in it.
More expensive architecture doesn't mean it has high value.
But just look at all the things that we spend money on. So I always give the argument of we spend $800 billion a year apparently on the military. Why can't we spend billions of dollars on actually creating environments for people to live in? So we actually have the money. It's how do we spend it? And I think it's important that as architects we actually advocate that we actually spend more on our built environment to engage people and to, I think the thing that's going to rescue us is culture. We need to create better human cultures that are interdependent on each other so that we are not, the opposite of that is isolation, which the corporations want. They want us isolated, which creates more, that we need stuff to fill the gaps. But if we become more cohesive culturally and more engaged culturally, I think we start to eliminate a lot of our problems, perhaps. I don't know. But this idea of what do we invest in, we have all of this money.
But the reason I started with the whole global financial thing is we don't have all this money. We borrow it. It's not real money. So
Right.
my point is, and the reason I started with that is once there is a actual provocation for not having access to these massive amounts of global capital,
Right.
then we can be altruistic all day long, and that's great. All three of us, everyone in this room is. But the actual economy and the entire society, I think, responds to the pressure points of, oh, we can't go to the bank and borrow $100 million. We can get, $2 million. What are we going to do for $2 million, right? And that's Stuart's life, at least in the morning, that's Stuart's life every day, right?
Right.
So I think that
But yeah,
it's going to be a question of when do we stop burning oil? Let's put
Well,
it that way,
yeah.
right? And I use that as an analog. We're burning oil, so we have this enormous amount of energy that has been built up over billions of years because
Right.
the dinosaurs. We're burning the dinosaurs, right? Thank you, Mr. T-Rex.
Right.
But eventually, we can't burn any more
Right.
T-Rexes. So.
well, the other thing is the supply systems that we saw during COVID being interrupted, and of course that was one of the reasons for inflation. So the idea of supply systems can easily be disrupted, and what happens when, of course, like even food systems, I mean, going back once again to the corporations, I mean, it's been consolidated. So because of that, it only takes one or two interruptions to displace the whole thing, and then we're really in trouble. So I think we saw that during COVID. It could happen easily again.
Yeah, I think that's true. Just one more point
Sure,
on this,
of course.
and then we'll go to another provocation. So, how I would try to pull all this together is this idea of automatic. Looking at how do we think about doing more for less. So, wood is such a great example. Any natural materials are a great example because you're taking labor out of it, right? You're not, and it's not an extractive material. It's a productive or reproductive material or renewable material, and so aluminum, unfortunately, is an extractive material. We extract materials, iron as well, though iron still can be recycled quite well. Where was I going with this? Yeah, so the idea of wood as a kind of automatic, but then on the design and then on the manufacturing side, and I think we'll talk about manufacturing later, how do we leverage technology to produce the highest quality, highest performing architecture at the lowest cost?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, I'd like to talk to you later about how capitalism eventually fails in like 5 years, because that's kind of what you're yeah. Maybe next
That's
month,
optimistic.
maybe in November, but you can kind of see this is sort of what you're talking about has already happened. The crash of 2007, 2008, there was no money to be lent to any project or anything, and architects didn't have very much to do. And as a culture, we were stalled for a while. And then again, COVID, when you couldn't get anything, you could spend a lot of money, but you couldn't get things in the field. You couldn't get things built because of the pandemic, the disruption of the way we do things.
But and this is the last thing I'll say on that. I think those were like little mini breaks relative to what we would see if capital markets dried up.
Sure.
And then we would have to fundamentally rethink things.
Yeah, it would be
not just take a break.
We would live in a different world, a very different world. So I'm going to push that topic a little bit further. In the last 30 years, we've seen massive change in how things are designed and manufactured. Cell phones, cars. Almost every field's been radically altered by technology. One that really hasn't so much, however, has been building construction. Despite technologies like 3D printing, and we see some examples of that, we essentially build most things the same way we did 100 years ago. While our design software and thinking have evolved with technology, construction methodologies largely have not. I think this will change eventually, but when will it change? And if it does, how will it change? And how will this change affect what the built environment functions like and looks like? So, who wants to take that first shot at that?
Well, that is a question. Will it look that different? I'll say on one end of the spectrum, the 3D printing at the scale of whole buildings being printed does look different than most of what our current fabric, the environment looks like. That's more, orthogonal and all of that. It's very organic in ways not really coming Well, maybe there is a certain sense of natural form in that, the kinds of that 3D printing does. But for the most part, what you're talking about was the advent of, with the Industrial Revolution, of factories prefabricating modular components. And that was meant to, and the early modern movement had more outcome from that than we currently have. The modular housing became associated with mobile homes and things that just didn't have a public reception. So the question is, will modularity finally and prefabrication of elements get more traction? Now, Kieran Timberlake is a firm that's trying to experiment with that. Even the hotel that just went up down on this block is prefabricated cellular kind of panels all over it, but it doesn't look that different. When people, I tell them that, they say, oh, it just looks like anything. So I don't know how different it will look. I'll finish by just saying that the pressure from the public has been to make things not look factory built. That's what they associate with trailer and mobile homes. So there's some allure of the authenticity, it's not really, of the craft, the sense of handmade and craft that a factory out, assembly lines don't feed that kind of sense of, what people look for in their materiality in spaces. So I don't know if it'll gain traction more now that with the digital revolution, more abilities of the robotics. Obviously, the Digital Fabrication Lab at Georgia Tech is trying to become a forerunner of the possibilities of using, CNC routing and printing and all those things. And actually, Tristan, you know more about what that. So I'll let you, if you're willing to talk about this topic.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna lean on the death of capitalism, but I think what's gonna push prefabrication, and I'm a huge believer in prefabrication and modularity. I think what's gonna push it is gonna be labor shortages, and especially skilled labor shortage. And again, we won't have a chance. We won't have adoption. Like, it's not gonna be a choice. You're gonna have to build things with robots in the factory. In controlled environments, and hopefully it doesn't just become a kind of, well, we do it because we have to do it. Hopefully we can think about what the new potentials are from that. I think a lot of architecture is going to look, buildings look like they did 2,000 years ago. Go to Rome. The buildings aren't that different, right? Walls, windows, doors, columns, floors. I mean, these are kind of elemental things. But I do think that there's a lot of potential for some architecture to evolve, and the great thing about architecture is the diversity, and that we want that. We want to maintain that. We want to keep a diverse range of aesthetics, of stories that we tell through architectural elements and through architectural compositions. But I do think that a big driver is going to be labor and the inability of getting buildings built on site.
Tristan, you've actually skipped a couple of questions, but anyway.
Sorry.
So,
Michael.
yeah, I think architecture is really slow to respond to things. It's also very professionally litigious. So, for example, just take the mycelium in architecture. I mean, green slate, there was a insulation material that was invented, I don't know, 10 years ago. They've been trying to put it in walls of buildings as an alternative to another kind of insulation, and they couldn't do it. Like, they can't get it approved. So now this product is used for packaging for expensive wine bottles, or it looks great because it has this great look to it. But they couldn't get an architectural application because you put it in a wall and it has these molds in it or something, and it might grow. Well, that would be highly problematic. So the idea that architecture is kind of resistant in a way to innovation in a certain way. So another one is Branch Technology. They devised this 3D print, this matrix with double curvature. And the idea was, you would print this matrix for houses and you could fill it with this insulation and then cover it. Well, they couldn't get it approved either, or they're still in process. So now what they use it for are for fire, for all kinds of things. But also, well, now they're using it to produce kind of 3D panels, but they're exteriorized. They're not necessarily structure. Or if they use it as a structural system, it's used as for an exhibition, or it's used for sculptures. So once again, there's a kind of resistance. And I mean, architecture can be incredibly innovative if you look at the work of Gaudi, but I think increasingly it's also more litigious and more resistant to risk, risk adverse. So, I mean, how do we innovate within those really tight parameters? So I think that's something that we really have to
I
deal
think,
with.
architecture is obviously very related in terms of safety and health and those kind of things, but also architecture is very expensive. I mean, people are spending a lot of money. Some people spend the most money they'll ever spend on a building, maybe their house. And so I think it leads to a kind of conservatism. You can design a new phone every year pretty easily, but you can't come up with a new architectural style every year. So sort of back to what Tristan was talking about, we had another question about labor shortages and how this would affect the world, and about modular and factory building and assembling parts. I know, Tristan, that this is something that you've been kind of heavily into. Is there anything else that you'd like to say about that? About will we eventually, I mean, I know the English have had systems for a long time that really rely on parts and pieces. That's the way they price things and build things. Do you think we'll start to see a lot more of that? And I guess more importantly, will that lead to our buildings being different, looking different? Will we inhabit them differently? Or, like you kind of alluded to, will we just get factory-built buildings that sort of look like what we already have and live like what we already have?
Yeah, I think we will get it. How soon and how much is to be determined. We've been hearing the promise of modularity and prefabrication for over 100 years. But again, why I keep coming back to this thing of like the necessity, right? Things will be required. Where I do think some innovation will happen is, and Stuart talked about Kieran Timberlake, this idea of design for disassembly, which I think is really, really interesting. I think there's a whole association and schools, and everybody needs to come together and create a consortium around this idea, just like with USB-Cs, and they just got rid of all the 1,000 different chargers in Europe now. You have to have a USB-C. I think we would have to have some sort of institute or consortium that would deal with that, so that we can think about how do you mix and match pieces, and how do you inventory pieces, right? Imagine that we're building buildings now that in 20 years there's going to be you disassemble them and they go into an inventory, and then you're building another building 5 years later and you just pick from the inventory, right? And they all interface and they all screw together in the same way, but you can kind of mix and match it, and it's going to be cheaper because you're going to be reusing materials. So that might be very sci-fi to some degree, and who maintains it and who writes the standards and all of that, I think, is a big issue. But I think there's huge potential there.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I might add, just in that same spirit of what you're talking about, even at a kind of low-tech level, the Life Cycle Building Center, most of you, I hope, are familiar with that really, after disassemblies, demolition, accumulates and, in a sense, kind of archives and catalogs all of these components of buildings. And they've been asked recently to think about not just, how to catalog it and make it available, because how do you know what's there? And they're trying to get bigger and bigger, have more things. But you're right that people ask, well, what's going to go together? And they're saying there are ways to classify components as to their abilities to join or connect or work, which is what you're saying.
Interfaces. What are the
Interfaces.
interfaces?
That's the word
Yeah.
they use now. And they said, well, what is the system? They're going to have to invent the system. They were saying that some people they knew at Perkins and Will that were doing red listing of materials. Could they do that for the ability for, as you're talking about, the interfacing of materials that be collected and reused in uncommon ways, or uncommon now, and can hopefully become more common in the future.
And I think it's really going to come down to, is there an entity, an organization, a national and international organization that creates those codes and standards that people work with?
Yes.
If everybody's doing their own system, it doesn't work.
Right.
There's an interesting firm in, it's a German firm, I can't remember the name, but they're working exactly, in this space in CLT. So they're creating a kind of suite of parts that you can put together in different ways in CLT, with the idea that this could be a year building, a 10-year building, or a 100-year building, all using the same system, which I think is fantastic.
It's interesting. So to talk about the environment a little bit and the sort of impacts that'll have, we obviously face monumental environmental challenges in the ever nearer future. I think the future is here. When it's 98 degrees for a week. But how will these challenges affect the built environment? What forms will emerge from environmental necessity? Specifically for all of you, but especially for Stuart and Michael, I think, how will the basic structures of nature and biology begin to affect our design thinking? And I know you guys are already looking at that and thinking about that, not only in terms of materials, but in terms of form. What can we learn from nature, and how will might we grow our future buildings instead of assembling them? That's a different possible path.
Well, yeah, some of that myco research is focused on the idea that you could actually grow structures, and there has been some research on that. So the idea that, you know, the mycelium might get engineered to perform in certain ways could certainly be on the horizon. You know, carbon fiber is also something that could be used to create structures that's super light and super strong. But as I mentioned, I mean, I just got back from Barcelona. Of course, Gaudí, I mean, looked at all kinds of organic, biological kind of systems. I mean, just going through Casa Mila, the idea of passively ventilating, you know, the residences by these small courtyards or larger courtyards for light, the idea of layering of different types of glass. So there's a translucent glass, which allows large pieces of translucent glass, which allow a ton of daylight, but also provide privacy. And this idea of how very thin kind of floor plates, because it's kind of Swiss cheese with all of the different kind of perforations in the floor plates, and these undulating planes, which he argues are stronger because undulation is stronger than a kind of flat surface. So, and even like in the, I mean, talk about parametric design. I mean, in the roof system, all of the different arches, like there's, I don't know, 70 different types. And of course, all of them are different. It creates this kind of undulating system. But he just didn't do it for the look. It was actually the idea of a hat. Of that, it's where they would absorb a lot of the heat from the solar gain, and it could be vented in this kind of attic space. So the idea of looking at just how things are vented, how you need to have temperature and pressure differentials for air to circulate. I mean, in a way, it's very straightforward physics. And how do you do that? So I'm sitting right here, and this, I'm getting a blast of cold air from that diffuser. The idea that that shouldn't be up there, we should have it in the floor, because that's where we need the cool air. We don't need it. This is a lot of energy to cool this space. It'd be much more effective if we had raised systems raised floors with HVAC systems in the floor would be much more effective. And so we have the solutions, actually. We need the investment in creating kind of better built environments.
You know, I agree, really. You've summed up what I might say. I just add to it, because looking at the Gaudí, of course, was an amazing sort of experimenter in these forms that grew out of nature and did some beautiful work. But a kind of related phenomenon, as you say, of undulation is these, my own students have worked with less literally the kind of curving sort of undulations as creased and perforated and pleated forms that can be creased and things. And there's a lot of preceding forms. Actually, Joseph Choma talked about it and has his students working with creasing. You can make concrete formwork that can take the pressure, the lateral pressure of concrete as it's being formed out of paper if it's creased in enough ways that, like corrugation, it has strength. So it's both can be beautiful, it can be very strong, and creases at certain scales actually become shading building forms instead of just being perpendicular planes to the sun's angles can be creased, and besides strength gain these intrinsic shading, self-shading structures. So much to be learned from nature that hopefully forms that we do as architects will relearn that. It won't even be inventing it from scratch. A lot of ancient and historic forms that didn't have air conditioning, had to, out of necessity, learn those great virtues of science and art intersecting in those ways.
Yeah, I also think that our advancing design technology can help us simulate these things and these things in nature more exactly and actually push that research forward where it wasn't so intuitive or so possible in the past. So maybe eventually the design abilities will lead to constructing new forms. Turning towards a kind of less definable aspects of a possible future, how would you define and how will you define what a good environment is, a good built environment, and what things should it accomplish? And this is probably more about the collective and about urbanism. Sustainability and necessary resilience will be important and mandatory, but how will we define a sense of beauty and a sense of place? These fundamental things have made cities an endless siren song for many millions throughout history. What's the future of the city? What's the future of the city as an attractor? So anybody wants to talk about that? Culture.
Culture is important. I think the idea that engagement, I think good architecture engages, and it engages at multiple levels. So it engages the environment, but it also engages people. It engages the gathering of people and the propagation of culture. I think we really miss the idea, and a lot of this, maybe architecture students miss the idea that actually architecture is cultural. It's a cultural product. It's not necessarily technical. Of course, there's a technical aspect. We have to incorporate technology, but ultimately, culture is what's going to rescue us and make our lives better. So the idea of how do you gather in a space, how do you make it comfortable, how do you light it, how do you cool it, so instead of this blast of cold air, maybe there could be a subtle breeze going horizontally. And I think it's really important to think about how cities work. And once again, being like in Paris and Barcelona recently, it's just so rich. And I think, of course, Atlanta's going through a lot of different periods of growth. We have the Beltline, we have the Gulch, we have the Stitch. There are these major infrastructural changes that are happening, different kinds of infrastructure for pedestrians, for cyclists, for us to see each other like face to face instead of through windshields. So the idea that we're creating another kind of city, and I'm actually writing about that as a kind of project so that we see these different projects cohesively, like we see the Beltline as something, we see the Gulch as something, or we see as the Stitch as something, and of course there are other projects going on. But how can we see it collectively as a way of making a city that, in a way, is in a state of repair? We have a modernist, we're recovering once again from modernism. It introduced interstate, highways that separated neighborhoods and separated, different socioeconomic groups or promoted racism or division. And in a way, we're in a state of continual healing from modernism. I think we have to be, in a way, very critical of modernism, and even in terms of architecture. It was highly experimental, but just look at concrete. Like, how do we make concrete? Of course, it's going to be highly brutal, a brutalist aesthetic, which I kind of like, I lecture about, but how, for people to live in it, it's difficult. I live in a concrete building. It's actually difficult to live in concrete all the time. It can be a little oppressive.
It's very hard.
It's very hard. And the way, the coloration of it, how do you take care of it? How do you take care of these buildings? And once again, they can be in a state of disrepair. So once again, going back to we've created all this stuff. How do we nurture it? How do we repair it? How do we make it more engaging for people? It's key.
Yes. I might just add, again, build on what I was saying, that a kind of agenda that I'd given my students to look at this challenge of the AI and biomimicry at not just individual organisms, but collectively as communities, because again, as you say, in how cities form, it turns out that, again, the research is into trees and how they gather as forest, and that the diversity of trees, well, let me back up and just say at one extreme, you'd think that a tree growing alone in a forest would get all the rainfall and all the nutrients of the soil around it, and that would be living in a bubble, so to speak, the best chance for their survival. But in fact, that's inverse. trees that can be adjacent in proximity to other trees are healthier, can sustain each other, and if the tree forest has some diversity in it too, because again, as we already know in crop rotation, if you have the same, homogeneity of a crop and it depletes all the same things, it's not cycling and sharing and distributing and things. So again, it's just a lesson that nature already knows that we as humans have to kind of relearn that density can be a good thing, diversity can be a good thing. It has to be planned, as you're saying, in good ways, but that, anyway, so it's interesting to see how architecture and urbanism can learn from those natural exemplars.
Yeah, so I would add two things. One is following directly on what Stuart just said, but I do think it's predicated again on our future access to resources. On our current trajectory, what does it mean to live anywhere? Are you part of a community, or do you just live somewhere? Most people in cities these days just live somewhere. They're not part of a community. So I do think that moving forward, if our ability to just sort of constantly move, pick up and move, is diminished, then our benefit from being part of a community rises. And I think people will commit to their communities and build their communities. So I think that's number one. And number two, I think Shumi gave us the answer. I think cities, what makes great cities are events. You talked about gathering. This place, look at this place. You could say shopping, but I'm not going to say shopping, right? That would go against the whole narrative tonight. But like the whole experience center and all of that kind of stuff. I think it's people like to go out, be together, hear laughing, hear stories, do things, hear a performance, dance, whatever it is. Just watch people. I love watching people. So I think the gathering and the kind of event and the experience part is going to be a big part of how future cities develop. And you already see it. Look at all of these northern sort of suburbs, the Alpharettas, the Roswells, the Woodstocks. They've all got their little, sort of town center where people go, and that's really driving the development. I'm actually part of a team right now that's looking at Cumberland and how to give Cumberland an identity, a place for people to get. Cumberland, like where the Braves are, up there. That place. Which is like, it's tough. It's a tough place, It's tricky, but we have some ideas. But yeah, I would say those are sort of the two future drivers for me in terms of what makes for great cities.
Yeah, I think at its best, Atlanta is probably a really excellent lab for these kind of cultural experiments because we're not an old northeastern city. We're not Charleston. We're not Paris. We never will be. To me, the Atlantas and Dallases and Houstons of the world are actually more interesting, at least to me, than all the places people would generally point to as being wonderful urban places. So,
Certainly more relevant in terms of
exactly. So, kind of, you guys have already mentioned a little bit of this, but how can the future built environment actually affect human behavior? There's obviously a lot that's been written over the years and speculation about this, but will our cities and towns be better places to live because we live in harmony with nature? I think so. But how might we avoid, the harsh, horrible, depleted futures of Blade Runner or the hyper-regulated one of Minority Report? I love science fiction, but can we make a future that's not a dystopia? Are there things we can do? Are there things we can avoid? And that's actually the last question I have. I think we should end on that, and we'll take questions from the audience.
I think once again, like the physical world is very important. Let's say there's this opposing the digital and the concrete, the abstract. The regulatory of the digital. I mean, there's a kind of we have to. I mean, just think of how we submit forms or we submit proposals. I mean, it's all through digital interfaces. And if you're not exactly doing it in the right way, there's no negotiation. You're just kind of cut off. So there's a kind of digital fascism that's going on, maybe increasingly so, where you're just kind of monitored. It doesn't matter who you are. You're just monitored the same way. And on the opposite side, the idea that we're physical beings, we have physical built environments, we interact in them. So this idea of how do these two kind of worlds interface? Maybe there is a kind of mixed reality where things are augmented through technology. I don't know if any of you have used the Vision Pro from Mac, but you can actually sign up for a demo, and so I did one of those, and it's really incredible. Like, it really does enhance, because there's a kind of engagement with the current world, but also a kind of digital overlay, and you really do. It's really quite something. So, for example, with your work environment, you could work here and be engaged in this, but then you could have your screens, wherever you want in terms positioned, and so there's a kind of somewhere in between this digital and this kind of physical world or analog world. So I think there's a kind of interesting tension between those two worlds.
Yeah, and it's also like, well, what do we think is beautiful and harmonious, those words that you used, right? Because that could be rewiring our brains in ways that we have no idea. And it is rewiring our brains, and social media is rewiring our brains. And so, like, how do we define beauty and harmony? That's going to be a very different thing for, I'm 46 and I have a 1-year-old, so for my kid, when he's my age, it's going to be a really different thing. We don't even know how to predict these things. I would give one answer, and I think it's about having a less extractive approach to architecture and a more regenerative. If I were to think about like a strategy for the future, it would be to not just burn all of our resources up, but to think much more. And I like that idea. I like that kind of duality of the extractive versus the regenerative, because, and it goes back to the trees versus, clinker for cement, right? And I love concrete, by the way. It's hard, but I love it. It's great. It's fantastic. I'd live in your apartment. But I think if we can create communities that are much more about regenerative than extractive, I think that's a recipe for potentially non-dystopic future.
I think we'll have to.
We'll have
that
to.
transition. Yeah. Stuart, did you have anything? I know you've always been fascinated with the idea of the machine in the garden and this kind of uniting of technology and nature.
Well, yes, and so this in between this, as you say, is kind of where I end up always landing or oscillating between the two. But what I think I want to say then is, and I appreciate you saying this is an individual lens I have, but I think the future, to me, hopefully, is not so individual that I have to make a statement right now. I actually, regeneratively, in your words, appreciate that this is a community discussion, and I'd really like for the rest of the community to join in. I don't think I have to stake any more individual statements here, so I think that's really what the future. It's because if anything, what I would say the problem, which we started with capitalism and other things, is that we increasingly are getting into bubbles and individual. We think now democracy is translated into choice and consumer, all this, but all that bubbling. In some ways, in individuals and everybody, we've got to innovate, and I got to say something different than you, and you different than that. But at some point, no, we just all share and talk as a community. So I'll shut up and listen to others
Perfect segue,
out there
yeah.
talk.
So we'll take questions from the audience. Anybody have anything they want to ask or provoke or state? Yeah, Brian.
So I'm curious with you, we saw a lot of the stuff you guys have been working on and known you guys for a while, and certainly Tristan from the very beginning. Where have you, when you kind of go through kind of where you started in your career and what you were looking at and interested in, and kind of how the future and the look of the future has altered and pulled you through, and kind of where you're going, and see the research you're doing and that career arc, and why you're gravitating in the way you're doing it.
I'll start. So I had this design build business in Montreal for 12 years, and I worked with my design partner, and it was a very kind of interesting relationship in that her family had investment money, so we were able to do these infill projects in Montreal, which has a very cohesive urban form. And so I become that was, although there were individual projects, the real project was the city and the consolidation of, although it's, of course, Montreal is not as fragmented as Atlanta, there's still this idea of consolidation of the urban block and kind of these infills. And so I think the bigger project, once again, is always the city, and even the idea of the materiality, physicality of cities. The built environment is just so important. I think as architects, we are probably some of the only people who really care about the nurturing of the built environment. And I think we really have to, I mean, I'm more committed to that than ever before. I think we, as a refuge almost from maybe the digital, like the investment in our physical world, so that we have a refuge, and maybe we can we can put away our phones and turn off our TVs and be in a place, or maybe we will never escape, the digital and, the physical. Maybe the digital is here to stay, but what about if we could turn it off at least for a moment? And so there's a lot of architects who are engaged in this idea of creating spaces that have kind of intense materialities, so that you feel like you're anchored to a place. So I think that's really important to think about architecture not necessarily as abstract, but kind of this hyper-physical reality. So it becomes even more physical. I think that's important.
Do you think architecture will eventually have to compete with the virtual? So that's a potential path where the physical world could become much more intense, or maybe the opposite. I don't know. But
Wait. Say that again. Architecture compete with the virtual?
If it has to compete with the virtual, where virtually anything can happen, or is it a hybrid? But yeah. Will that mean that future architecture has to be much more interactive, much more intense, in order to not to be boring compared to the virtual world? I guess.
That's a tough one. Maybe more calm.
Or the opposite.
Well-
Could totally be the opposite. Yeah.
Well, the trajectory of what you're asking about with what you're saying is that, how will the physical world compete with the virtual world? You talked about with the Vision Pro and all of that sense of virtual reality, and some sci-fi is, of course, projected into the future a bit. I don't know, Ready Player One and others, where in fact the physical environment, if it's going to get down to $100 a square foot because of those things, will just be very simple box houses that you have no character or particular romance or any other physical pleasures, but you're in the goggles, and it won't matter because you're inhabiting the world that you're luxuriating in is all virtual. That's what's at $1,000 a square foot in appearance, but it's $100 a square foot physical. Now that's, to me, a dystopic world from an architect's standpoint, but these are the issues that come up that you raised with the first question.
Yeah, and look at a city like Hong Kong or Shanghai, where people live in shoeboxes, literally, and those cultures have adopted digital technologies much more rapidly. Really? Much more rapid. Oh, absolutely, yeah, for sure. I was just going to maybe try to answer Brian's question. I think for me, I do a lot of different things. Sometimes it can be a double-edged sword. It can be a problem. If I were to try to talk about what I'm really interested in across all of my work, which is sculpture, architecture, sort of invention, it would be innovation and invention. So whether it's any of those domains, art, architecture, or design, what I'm really interested in is innovation, asking questions about how do we innovate, how do we invent, how do we be super creative to have either a kind of beauty or culture or a sort of better performance or whatever it may be. I think that's something that you can find across. That's a thread that you'll find across all of my kind of various endeavors. Maybe that's obvious. Maybe everybody feels that way. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. Actually, it's interesting, and I appreciate, because I know your innovations, and they're very deep. When I mentioned at the beginning of my thing about the seeming biomimicry and the superficiality of that which is on the surface and which is deeper, innovation to me is tricky word. It's kind of the charge. It's the spark of capitalism, meaning everything is valued through innovation because how it's marketed. So, innovation that just is branding and difference for the sake of other reasons, to me, I'm a little wary. My students all just say, which the most innovative thing on the wall is going to be the one that's heralded. And so I get suspicious of innovation, but actually the way you frame it, I agree with you. It's innovating at a very deeper level.
For sure.
And
Not the marketing innovation.
right. So it's a tricky word, just like mimicry. All these words have connotations. So.
Yeah, so anybody else? Well, thank you very much for a very provocative and interesting conversation today. And please look at our website and for the recording, both for the recording of this and the documentation of this, and for the announcement of the next forum in the series. Thank you very much.